Quick little PSA, the Pure Grip Socks Black Friday sale is now live, where you can get 20% off everything on the website with coupon code BF2025. We don't do a ton of sales because we try to keep our prices as fair and affordable all year round, but if you've been curious to try out any of the Pure products or just need to re-up on some stuff, this is as low as the prices are going to be pretty much all year long. Check it all out at puregripsocks.com. Thank you so much for all your support, and without wasting any more of your time, let's get into the video. Regardless of the launch drama, the Puma Future 8 Ultimate, in my opinion, was by a long shot the worst top-end football boot on offer from any of the big three brands. And in this box, I have its replacement, which with any new model, I think the expectation is always improvement. But when you're starting with the bar as low as it is for the Future 8, it shouldn't be that hard to make something at least a little bit better. Ladies and gentlemen, say hello to the new Puma Future 9 Ultimate, something that in my opinion sits in between a redesign and a refresh of what the Future 8 introduced, in that it does recycle the same sole plate and stud pattern tooling of that previous generation, although Puma do claim to have made some minor tweaks to it, with an upper that's still called Fusion Fit and still utilizes many of the same elements and technologies, but instead of being separated into two layers, an internal sock with little texture dots and then a plastic outer layer acting as your upper, all of those elements have now been incorporated into one singular piece of material, effectively making it like every other football boot, which sounds boring and kind of like a bad thing, but trust me when I say this is so much better than how the Future 8 upper felt. Having said that, being better than the Future 8 isn't exactly a huge accomplishment, where instead of comparing the old to the new, I think the big thing that we need to talk about in today's video is how does the Future 9 stack up against the competition? In other words, is there any reason to go and spend $245 on these versus what you can get from other brands, most notably in Nike with the Phantom 6 and in Adidas with the Predator series? And yes, for those of you that did catch it, Puma did decide to increase the price of the Future 9 by $5 coming from the Future 8. So like we always do on this channel, we're going to talk about what's good, what's not good, where I think Puma still needs to make some significant improvement, how they fit and feel on feet, and of course how they stack up against other options in the control category. In other words, is there any reason for you to go out and buy the Puma Future 9 Ultimate? Because we know for sure there wasn't much of a reason to buy the Future 8. So if you're interested in learning more, including how they fit and feel on feet, please stick around. And if you are interested in a pair for yourself, you can pick them up below their normal retail price by way of some exclusive SR4U coupon codes via the first link down below. And as always, if you guys enjoy the content, find it helpful, don't forget to drop a like on the video. And if you appreciate the brutally honest, unsponsored, unsugar-coated content on this channel, make sure you hit that subscribe button along with the little bell notification so you don't miss out on my reviews of all the latest football boots of 2025 and of course as we head into 2026. Where first things first, if I haven't already made it abundantly clear, I think that the Future 9 is a huge improvement over the Future 8 that it replaces. Having said that, I also think that there are a lot of elements from the Future 8 that still carry over into this Future 9 model, some of which are good and I guess new and improved in that regard, and some of which I'm still not a huge fan of. With the biggest change by far being the upper, where instead of being broken up into two different layers, it's now one single piece of material pretty well all the way through, giving you that one piece enclosure. Whereas a base, you have an engineered mesh, which is something that we've seen on the Puma Future series many times before. You have a bunch of micro texturing on the surface, as well as some pretty long ridges that provide some grittiness and extra grip on the surface. You can also see peeking through parts of that engineered mesh, these little circular dots that are effectively the 3D dot foam that we saw on the previous generation, but instead it's now kind of just sandwiched into the upper rather than floating freely on that internal sock like it was on the Future 8. This is what's going to provide a little bit of a dampening effect through the forefoot and toe box area where they're mostly positioned, and then internally it's lined with a very thin layer of foam and generally just a soft material that I would argue feels really good against your foot. However, my main takeaway from this upper, both in terms of in-hand feel as well as when you get them on your feet, is that it's a lot more plasticky than I think a lot of people might expect. Definitely not as stiff as what the Future 8 had on offer, but certainly if you're comparing these football boots to every other top-end model from all the major brands, Puma included, this definitely has one of the most structured, rigid, stiffest feels. Which I realize sounds like a bad thing, and honestly for a lot of people, it certainly isn't a good thing, including myself. I wouldn't say that the feel of this upper is necessarily my cup of tea, but if you like a slightly thinner, more rigid and structured feel, not just to the upper, but to the entire boot as a whole, then I definitely think there are some redeeming qualities of the Future 9. And in that regard, it's not dissimilar to the Future 8 that it replaces, but due to some modifications in the shaping, the fit, as well as especially the heel, I definitely think that the more structured, stiffer feel of the Future 9 is an improvement over the Future 8, but it also is still very much an acquired taste in that if you're expecting that step in comfort that so many top-end football boots seem to have these days, not that they don't soften up a little bit and become more pliable as you wear them in, but certainly I don't think that, at least from a comfort perspective, these are on the same level as most other top-end models. At the same time though, given that Puma also just released the King 20 Ultimate, these two football boots within the same line could not fit and feel more like polar opposites, where I think with a lot of brands these days, we complain about all their boots being a little bit too similar. That is not the case with Puma's latest offerings. The King and the Future are very different. Something that I do think is a good thing. Where from a touch perspective, I think that the Future 9 does stand out in the sense that it's on the thinner side, but also provides some grip, but also has that little bit of dampening that you do notice from those 3D dots scattered throughout the forefoot. The grip that you have here is less sticky and more so gritty because it's made up by way of ridges and texturing rather than just making the surface of the upper super sticky. So it's not necessarily going to provide the same grip on the ball as consistently as something like the grip knit upper of the Phantom 6, or provide that same bite as the rubber elements that you might find on a Predator. But if you're looking for very consistent added grip on the ball without being too sticky across the entire foot, I think this does a pretty good job of that. And it is also pretty cool that the upper as a whole is still very much on the thinner side, but because of those 3D dots as well as that thin layer of foam on the inside, it does have that slight amount of dampening and cushion on the ball without losing that structure. Across the top of the foot, the design is overall pretty standard for most football boots with a one-piece upper, where you can see the lacing system, while quite shallow, utilizes a fairly normal dual lace hole setup, and also is filled in with that elasticated knit material with a little bit of their power tape reinforcement in silver running from the top lace hole position on either side and then kind of flowing towards the middle. In all honesty, it really doesn't do much. The purpose of power tape historically is to reduce stretch in the stretchy parts of the upper, and I suppose this does a little bit of that, but in all honesty, if they didn't physically write power tape on that piece of material, I would have just assumed it was part of the design because you really don't feel it when the boots are on your feet. And then with the laces tied tight, in general, the lockdown is hugely improved over the Future 8, but that has less to do with the lacing system and more to do with the redesign of the heel, where the standard Future model has what I would say is kind of a mock mid-cut collar, or somewhere in between a mid and a low, where it is a fairly traditional low-cut construction, and then you just have a slight bit of extension in the form of this elasticated knit flowing all the way around the opening. The heel features an internal structure, and the shaping has been changed up in such a way where it seems to fit a little bit more snug, offer a little bit more depth to the heel, where I always found the Future 8 was more so on the shallower side and didn't do a good job of containment, where your heel doesn't necessarily pop out, but it never felt like it was as locked down as what you'd find from a lot of other models. And the lining on the inside has plenty of padding, more so than the previous model. Does a really good job of holding your heel. Obviously feels quite comfortable because of that as well. And then is lined in this really soft kind of microfiber material, where once again, despite all the similarities to the Future 8, even though this doesn't look visually that different, it feels a lot better. And then as far as the insole is concerned, I'll remove that really quickly for you guys. You can see it still features their nano grip material on the surface that isn't particularly grippy on this particular colorway. That's something that I've noticed about Puma insoles, is they always put the nano grip technology, but the actual grippiness of the material itself varies a lot from colorway to colorway. And they've also made the foam apparently slightly thicker to reduce some volume inside of the upper. Do you really notice that? In my opinion, no, but you can see it's made from a single layer of white foam with this perforated yellow foam as an insert pretty much through the forefoot heel, and I guess technically not the midfoot, but that part isn't really that important anyways. And just for reference on insole thickness, here's the Future 9 insole, here's the Future 8 insole. If you sandwich them together, you can see that the Future 9 insole is just a smidge thicker. Where I'm not even sure if you can see it on camera, but I can assure you in person, it is definitely a little bit thicker. And then moving to the base of the Future 9, like I mentioned earlier, the Soleplate and stud pattern tooling has been recycled from the previous generation, although according to Puma, due to complaints of stiffness from the Future 8, they've actually changed the toe board, or the reinforcement underneath the actual stud plate that you can see, to make it more flexible. And the end result is, if they didn't tell us that, I would have assumed no changes have been made. In other words, it pretty much feels exactly the same as the Future 8, which I would argue is not necessarily a good thing. And that this sole plate is really, really stiff, feels pretty substantial underfoot, but not necessarily in an overly bulky way. But for how stiff it is, it doesn't really have that responsive sensation, where of course, so many speed boots these days add stiffness to the sole plate to give you that energy return, or at least that sensation of kind of springiness under your foot. You do not get that with the Future 8 or the Future 9. It just feels stiff for the sake of being stiff, which is not a feeling that I'm personally a fan of. And then as far as the bladed FG stud pattern is concerned, it's pretty well the same one that we've been getting on the Future series for a number of years now, where it does provide plenty of bite when pushing off in pretty much every direction. And while there is some prioritization in the design for rotational movements, given that this is marketed more so as a control boot, in general, it has the aggressiveness of most speed boots in terms of providing tons of bite when pushing off in just about every direction. The studs are also on the longer side, so not particularly AG friendly, although you really shouldn't be wearing bladed studs on artificial grass anyways, period. But if the ground is even on the harder side, you might find that these studs are a little bit too long. On really well-kept natural grass surfaces though, I think the traction is top notch. And then there's the weight, which I think is another area where the Future 8 was definitely lacking in comparison to the competition. So as we always do, we're gonna weigh the old model, compare it to the new model, and also compare it to one of its main competing options in the Nike Phantom 6 Elite High, all in the same size, 9.5 US. We'll start off with the Future 8 Ultimate, and you can see that they weigh in at 9.7 ounces, the equivalent of 274 grams. So obviously not particularly lightweight. We'll change the scale back to ounces, and we'll throw on the new Future 9 Ultimate, and you can see that they weigh in at 9.6 ounces, the equivalent of 272 grams. So they're lighter by only a couple of grams. And then we'll throw on the Phantom 6, and you can see that they weigh in at 7.4 ounces, the equivalent of 210 grams. In other words, the Future 8 Ultimate was basically the heaviest top-end football boot that you can get from the big three brands, and the Future 9 just takes its spot over, going down by just a couple of grams, but not enough to really make for any major difference in regards to feel. If you're looking for a lightweight pair of football boots, this is not necessarily it, and certainly in comparison to some of its main competition, the Nike and even Adidas alternatives are significantly lighter. When it comes to the fit and feel on feet, while again, definitely better than how the Future 8 fit, I don't think the Future 9 is particularly impressive relative to not just other control boots, but other high-end boots in general, where I've often used this example. If you were to try on a bunch of different football boots with a blindfold on, I would not expect very many people to say that this is the pair that felt the most comfortable. Like I mentioned earlier, the upper has tons of structure to it, not to the point where it doesn't move and bend with your foot, but it definitely has more of that kind of rigid, plasticky sensation. Pair that up with a shallow lacing system and what is still admittedly similar shaping to the Future 8, where it's slim through the heel, slim through the midfoot, wider through the forefoot, and then tapers back to being quite narrow through the toe box, with generally lower volume all the way through than what the Future 8 had. And what you end up with is a really tight fitting but also stiff upper pair of football boots that, when paired up with an also very stiff sole plate, just makes for a relatively rigid sensation on feet. Where particularly through the midfoot, because of this, I think the lockdown is quite solid and it feels like you have a lot to push off on, but at the same time, there's just some dead space through the toe box and forefoot area because of the shaping. The heel, while improved over the previous model, still is nothing groundbreaking from a lockdown perspective, and as you can see, you still get some really ugly folds and creases because of the lack of pliability to this upper that, again, as you wear them in, definitely does soften up slightly, but if you're expecting that sock-like sensation from what looks to be a pair of sock boots, you are going to be at least a little disappointed. From a width perspective, I would definitely say that overall these have a slimmer profile, particularly through the midfoot. So if you do have wide feet, I do not think these will be a good option for you. In general, they just have a tight wrap despite falling in the control category. I think you expect that more from a speed boot, but like I said, they just have kind of an unusual shape to them. And then as far as sizing is concerned, just like the Future 8, they run about a quarter size long. So I'm wearing these in my usual size 9.5. I couldn't really go down half a size just because they would then be too short in length. So for the vast majority of people, I would recommend going true to size, but of course, depending on the specific shape and length of your feet, that extra quarter size is either going to be a little bit too long or perhaps even just perfect. Regardless, if you're looking at the Future, true to size is what I would personally recommend. All in all though, not the most comfortable football boots, especially for pushing $250. Foot cramping is something that I'm used to when it comes to breaking in a bunch of new football boots, but the foot cramping that I got during the break-in process of these was just way worse than what I'm used to, especially for a top-end model. So in conclusion, if you were one of the few people that loved the fit, feel, and experience of the Puma Future 8 Ultimate, then I think you should probably upgrade to the Future 9 because it is definitely an improvement on that design concept. In saying that, while a definite improvement over the model it replaces, it's still similar enough to the Future 8 to the point where I can't really say that anybody should be running out to buy the latest and greatest Puma Future. By high-end football boot standards, not even just control boots that it's competing against, it's quite heavy, it's quite stiff, and it's quite unremarkable in more ways than one. Where don't get me wrong, if you like a more solid, sturdy, and dare I say stiffer feel to your football boots, the Future 9 might be the perfect one for you. But I think for the vast majority of people that are expecting top tier comfort and top tier feel and great sole plates and a lightweight construction and all the things you would want from a football boot that retails for nearly $250, unfortunately, I think the Future 9, while an improvement over what they had before, still falls pretty short.